April 28, 1945. Berlin was dying. Soviet artillery shells were exploding across the ruined city. They came every few seconds. The thunder was so constant it became like breathing. A deep, terrible rhythm of destruction. Deep beneath the Reich Chancellery was a concrete tomb. The Führerbunker. Inside, Adolf Hitler paced like a caged animal. The man who had conquered most of Europe was now trapped. His world had shrunk to a space smaller than most apartments. Soviet tanks were less than a mile away. He had just asked his personal pilot to prepare a plane for escape. The pilot's response would become one of history's most controversial moments. "Mein Führer," he said, "there is no fuel left." But that wasn't entirely true, and both men knew it. The pilot's name was Hans Baur. He had been Hitler's personal pilot since 1933. For 12 long years, he had flown the Führer everywhere. He took him to rallies. He flew him to military meetings and secret conferences. During the war's great triumphs, Baur piloted Hitler across Europe. He landed at airfields from Paris to Warsaw. Baur was one of the very few people Hitler genuinely trusted. He was part of the tiny inner circle allowed into the Führer's private life. When Hitler spoke of loyalty, he often used Baur as his example. The pilot was an SS Brigadeführer. This was a rank roughly equal to a brigadier general. He wore his Nazi uniform with pride. He was a true believer. Or, at least, he had been. The request for an escape plane came during a meeting in Hitler's private study. It was April 28th. In the room were Baur, Martin Bormann, Joseph Goebbels, and General Wilhelm Burgdorf. Hitler had been ranting about betrayal. Heinrich Himmler, his most loyal follower, had just tried to surrender to the Western Allies. He used Swedish intermediaries. Hermann Göring, the leader of the Luftwaffe, had sent a telegram. He asked to take over as Führer if Hitler did not escape Berlin. The men Hitler trusted most had abandoned him, or they had tried to seize his power. Now, he was considering the unthinkable. He wanted to abandon Berlin. He wanted to fly south to Berchtesgaden. This was the eagle's nest in the Bavarian Alps. From there, he would make a last stand. Hitler turned to his pilot. He said, "Baur, you have always been loyal. I need you now more than ever. Prepare a plane. We leave tomorrow at dawn. We fly to Berchtesgaden. We will continue the fight from there. The southern armies are still intact. We can regroup." Baur stood silent for a long moment. Then, he said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Mein Führer, I regret to inform you that there is no aviation fuel available in Berlin. The last reserves were used yesterday. It is impossible to fly out." The room went dead quiet. Martin Bormann's eyes widened. Joseph Goebbels stared at Baur. His expression could have been respect. Or it could have been fear. Hitler's face turned red. Then it went white. He asked in a dangerous, quiet voice, "No fuel?" "None at all." Baur stood at attention. He repeated, "None, mein Führer. The refineries are destroyed. The supply lines are cut. The fuel depot at Tempelhof was captured by the Soviets yesterday. There is no way to get the amount of fuel we need for a flight to Bavaria." But documents discovered after the war tell a different story. When Soviet forces captured what was left of Berlin's airports, they found flight logs and fuel records. These records showed something else. There were still scattered fuel reserves at Gatow airfield. Gatow was on the western edge of Berlin. There was enough fuel for maybe 1 or 2 flights. Not much, but potentially enough to get Hitler out. They would have needed to use one of the smaller planes. There was more proof. Just the day before, General Robert Ritter von Greim had flown into Berlin. He flew in a Fiesler Storch. This was a small reconnaissance plane. It needed very little fuel. If von Greim could fly in, then someone could certainly fly out. So why did Baur lie? The truth is more complex than simple treachery. It is more than cowardice. After the war, Baur was interrogated many times. He gave multiple explanations for his actions that day. Sometimes, his stories contradicted each other. To Soviet interrogators in 1945, he insisted he had told the truth. He said there really was no fuel available. To Western intelligence officers years later, he admitted something else. He said there might have been some fuel. but not enough to guarantee success. In his memoir, published in the 1950s, he gave another reason. He claimed he was trying to protect Hitler. He said he wanted to save him from the humiliation of being shot down by Soviet fighters during an escape. Each version of the story shows a different layer of what really happened in that bunker. The most credible picture comes from comparing Baur's various accounts. We can also look at the testimony from other survivors. What emerges is a portrait of a man who made a split-second decision. He had many conflicting motivations. First, there was a genuine practical concern. Even if they found fuel, the flight would be suicidal. Soviet fighters controlled the skies over Berlin. Soviet anti-aircraft guns surrounded the city. The Luftwaffe, once the master of European skies, was a shadow. It was now just a handful of planes flown by exhausted pilots. The chances of successfully flying Hitler to Bavaria were slim at best. But there was something deeper going on. Baur had been watching Hitler fall apart for months. The man he had served for 12 years was now a physical wreck. Hitler's left hand trembled constantly. He probably had Parkinson's disease. He was addicted to injections from his doctor, Theodor Morell. Morell was a quack. His injections were a cocktail of amphetamines and God knows what else. Hitler spent hours staring at maps. He moved around armies that no longer existed. He issued orders to divisions that had been destroyed weeks ago. Hitler had become untethered from reality. Baur could see it. In the days before that final request, Baur saw something that shook him to his core. Hitler had received reports about Army Group Steiner. He had ordered Steiner to attack and relieve Berlin. The reports said Steiner had failed to launch the attack. The truth was, Steiner's forces barely existed anymore. When Hitler learned this, he flew into a rage. It was a rage unlike anything Baur had ever seen before. Hitler screamed that he had been betrayed by everyone. He said the German people had proven themselves weak. He said they were unworthy. They deserved to be destroyed by the Soviets. Goebbels and the others stood frozen. Hitler ranted. He said that Germany's destruction was inevitable. He said the stronger race would prevail. He said the Slavic peoples had proven themselves superior. Baur listened to this tirade. He realized something terrifying. Hitler had given up. Not on himself, but on Germany. The man who had promised to make Germany great again was now saying Germany deserved annihilation. And Baur, who had joined the Nazi Party out of a genuine belief in German restoration. Baur, who had flown Hitler to rallies where the Führer promised glory and redemption. This man now realized he had been serving a madman. Not just a cruel dictator. Not just a failed military leader. But someone who was genuinely, clinically insane. So when Hitler asked about escape planes, Baur made a decision. It was not a conscious decision. It was not part of a planned betrayal. It was instinctive. He would not help Hitler escape. He would not give this madman a chance to continue the war from Bavaria. He would not let him send more young Germans to die for a cause that was already lost. He would not fly Hitler out so he could make more speeches. Speeches calling for last stands and suicide missions. Instead, he would lie. He would say there was no fuel. He would trap Hitler in Berlin. He would make him face the consequences of what he had created. The lie worked because it was plausible. Everyone in the bunker knew Berlin was cut off. Supplies were almost gone. When Baur said there was no fuel, it fit with everything else that was falling apart. Hitler did not investigate further. He did not send someone else to check the fuel supplies. He simply accepted what his trusted pilot told him. Hitler had built his entire regime on personal loyalty. Now, that same system of personal loyalty was being used to trap him. But Baur's lie had an accomplice. His name was Martin Bormann. After the meeting, Bormann pulled Baur aside. He asked him quietly, "Is it true about the fuel?" Baur looked at him and said, "Does it matter?" Bormann studied him for a moment. Then he nodded slightly. Bormann had been scheming for power throughout the war. He had maneuvered himself into being Hitler's private secretary. He controlled all access to the Führer. He understood immediately what Baur had done. And Bormann made a calculation. If Hitler escaped to Bavaria, Bormann's power would be diluted. He would have to deal with other military officers and party officials there. But if Hitler stayed in Berlin and died, Bormann might have a chance. He could escape on his own. He could preserve some power in whatever came after. So Bormann backed up Baur's lie. When Hitler later asked Bormann to confirm the fuel situation, Bormann said he had checked with the Luftwaffe command. He said they confirmed there was no fuel available for extended flights. It was a conspiracy of two men. Neither was particularly heroic. Both were acting from mixed motives. But together, they sealed Hitler's fate in Berlin. The next day was April 29th. Inside the bunker, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony. There was no celebration. There was no joy. It was a quiet, grim affair. That same day, Hitler dictated his last will and testament. It was a rambling document. He blamed the Jews for starting the war. He expelled Göring and Himmler from the Nazi Party. They were traitors, he said. There was no more talk of escape. Hitler had accepted that he would die in Berlin. We do not know if he ever suspected that Baur had lied to him about the fuel. If he did, he never confronted his pilot about it. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler shot himself. Eva Braun took cyanide. Their bodies were carried up the stairs to the garden above. They were doused with petrol and set on fire. Hans Baur was one of the men who helped carry Hitler's body up those stairs. Years later, he described the moment. He said, "I had flown this man across Europe. I had been proud to serve him. Now, I was carrying his corpse to be burned in a shell crater. And all I could think was, thank God I didn't fly him out. Thank God this is finally over." But it wasn't over for Hans Baur. After Hitler's death, chaos consumed the bunker. Some people tried to surrender. Others tried to break out through the Soviet lines that surrounded them. Baur decided to try to escape. On the night of May 1st, he joined a group attempting to break through the Soviet encirclement. They made it several blocks before being surrounded. During the firefight, Baur was shot in the leg. Soviet troops captured him. He would spend the next 10 years in Soviet prison camps. During his captivity, his captors interrogated him again and again. They were obsessed with the final days in the bunker. The Soviets wanted to be absolutely sure Hitler was really dead. They worried he might have somehow escaped. They asked Baur over and over about the fuel. Could Hitler have flown out? Was it possible? Baur stuck to his story. There was no fuel. Escape was impossible. Hitler died in the bunker. The Soviets eventually believed him. But they kept him imprisoned anyway. He was a valuable witness. He was released in 1955. Baur returned to Germany. He tried to build a quiet life, away from the horrors of the past. But in 1956, he published a memoir. It was called Hitler's Pilot. In the book, he portrayed himself as a loyal servant. A man who had simply done his duty until the very end. He downplayed his role in trapping Hitler in Berlin. He framed his decision as a purely technical one. It was just about the fuel, he claimed. There wasn't any. The book was controversial. Some Germans saw him as a Nazi who was trying to profit from his service to a monster. Others saw him as a witness to history. A man who deserved to tell his story. But in private conversations in his later years, Baur told a different story. A journalist interviewed him in the 1960s. The journalist later reported that Baur had admitted something significant. Baur said he could probably have found fuel if he had really tried. He admitted he had made a conscious decision. He decided to deny Hitler any chance of escape. He said he had come to believe that Hitler was leading Germany to total destruction. He believed Hitler needed to be stopped. The journalist asked Baur if he considered himself a hero for this. Baur's response was bitter. He said, "Heroes don't serve monsters for 12 years and only find their conscience in the last week. I'm not a hero. I'm just a coward who finally realized he was on the wrong side." The historical debate about Baur's actions continues to this day. Some historians argue he was just following orders. They say he was simply making a practical assessment about the fuel. It was a military decision, not a moral one. Others see him differently. They believe he made a last-minute moral choice. A choice that helped end the war slightly sooner. By preventing Hitler from rallying forces in Bavaria, he may have saved lives. Still others view him as a committed Nazi. A man who betrayed Hitler only when he realized the cause was lost. They say he acted out of self-preservation, not principle. What is clear from the evidence is this: fuel was available. It was scarce, but it existed. General von Grimm's flight into Berlin on April 26 proved that planes could still operate in and out of the city. It was extremely dangerous, but it was possible. The small Fiesler Storch that von Grimm used needed very little fuel. Hans Baur could have attempted an escape flight. It might have failed. Hitler might have been shot down by Soviet fighters. But it was a possibility. Baur chose to say it was impossible. And that choice kept Hitler in Berlin. One of the most revealing documents about this whole episode is a letter Baur wrote to his wife. It was 1946, and he was still in the Soviet prison camp. The letter was never sent. Soviet censors confiscated it. It was preserved in KGB archives and was only discovered after the fall of the Soviet Union. In the letter, Baur wrote, "I think about that last conversation with the Führer every day. I told him there was no fuel. But there was fuel. Not much, but some. I could have tried. Maybe we would have made it. Maybe not. But I didn't try. I let him stay and die in that bunker. Sometimes I think I should have tried to save him because I had sworn loyalty. But then I remember his last speeches. I remember him saying Germany deserved destruction. I remember him talking about the weak being culled. And I know I did the right thing. Not for Germany. Not for the world. But because that man had become poison. And I would not help that poison spread any further." The other people in the bunker that day had their own reactions to Baur's refusal. Joseph Goebbels seemed relieved. It was as if he had wanted Hitler to stay and die in Berlin all along. He wanted a mythic ending for his leader, not a pathetic escape. Martin Bormann was calculating. He was already planning his own escape attempt. General Bergdorf would shoot himself the next day. He looked at Baur with an expression that might have been gratitude, or it might have been contempt. And Hitler himself. He seemed almost relieved. Perhaps a part of him had wanted Baur to say no. Perhaps his request for a plane had been a test. A way of confirming that escape was impossible. So he could finally justify ending his own life. In the larger scope of World War II, Baur's lie about the fuel probably didn't change the final outcome. Hitler was finished no matter what. Germany was utterly defeated. The war in Europe would end within days, whether Hitler died in Berlin or in Bavaria. But in the specific way the war ended, Baur's decision did matter. It kept Hitler from potentially rallying die-hard units in the south. It prevented a protracted, bloody last stand in the Alps. It kept him from issuing more orders for scorched earth destruction. Orders to destroy what was left of Germany's own infrastructure. It ensured that the Nazi leadership remained fragmented and disorganized in those final days. They could not regroup around a living Hitler in Bavaria. The moment Baur said, "There is no fuel left," was not a major turning point in the war. It was more like closing a door that was already mostly shut. But it was a door that Baur chose to close. Consciously or unconsciously, he closed it because he had finally seen his leader clearly. He did not see a genius, or a visionary, or even a competent military leader. He saw a delusional madman. A man who would sacrifice everything and everyone rather than admit defeat. Hans Baur died in 1993. He was 96 years old. His obituaries identified him as Hitler's personal pilot. He was a footnote to history. They rarely mentioned the fuel that may or may not have existed. They rarely mentioned the lie that may or may not have been told. They rarely mentioned the decision that may or may not have trapped Hitler in Berlin. But in the strange mathematics of history, small choices sometimes echo across decades. Baur's "no fuel left" became one of the final sentences in Hitler's story. It was not a heroic act of resistance. It was not a brave stand against evil. It was a simple lie, told by a compromised man. A man who had finally, belatedly, decided he would not help anymore. Sometimes, that is the best that humanity can manage. Not heroism, but simply the refusal to continue serving monsters.